For those that don't know me, I'm Elaine O'Neill. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Farm Forestry Association. And today we have John Keller online. He's going to give us this wonderful presentation. John's a consulting forester with Cascade Woodland Design, which is his own firm. And like so many people in WFFA, you know, they retire and then they reinvent themselves. So he's reinvented himself as a consulting forester. Before that, he worked with DNR for quite a long time. He was actually a stewardship forester with DNR, and he's a longtime WFFA member. So it's just delightful when we have WFFA members who have a passion and they're doing something and they want to share it with the rest of us. And so today, John is going to report out on a special project he's doing on figured maple for Pacific Rim Tonewoods. And for people that don't know what figured maple is, it's the stuff they make guitars with.
Yeah, as Elaine said, my name is John Keller, consulting forester. The work I'm doing right now is primarily boots on the ground for Pacific Rim Tonewoods for a project that we're going to discuss a little bit later. But here are some of the things that I'm hoping we'll be able to cover here and give you a good idea what figured maple is all about by the end of the presentation. So we're going to go through first off and generally talk about what figured wood is, and then work our way to specifically figuring and big leaf maple. There'll be 4 different types we'll talk about later. And then finally, we're going to try to discuss just not only the identification of figured maple, but what may or may not be causing it, and then the research project that I'm involved with. You can see my contact information right there. It will also be at the end of the presentation, but if I forget later, I would encourage you to jot it down, or if you have any other questions, and I'm hoping I'll get some responses from some of you sometime after the presentation. Please, please contact me. That's what I'm hoping for. So what is figuring wood? It's generally distinctive. All trees actually have some type of figuring when it comes down to it. It's generally applied to real distinctive patterns and markings that are aesthetically pleasing, and these patterns occur because of the color, which could be affected by how growth rings are, or whether it's sap or heartwood, the luster or sheen from light reflection, texture, meaning whether or not it's fine or coarse grain wood, and then grain, which really refers to the direction of wood fibers. And then finally, and this is where we will ultimately end up at, is the characteristic that some woods, particularly figured maple, has to catch the grain in such of a way that it reflects light. So here's just a little bit of wood anatomy I'd like to go over quickly, so that we have a little bit of the same vocabulary. And I think many of you will have already heard this, but just a quick review of the parts of a tree trunk or log. So in the middle, you have the heartwood, which is usually different, and the heartwood is essentially a bunch of it's essentially dead wood. It's heartwood is what used to be sapwood, which is the plumbing of the tree that transports water and minerals and makes up a large part of it. Anyways, the heartwood used to be sapwood before it got clogged up, but it still does provide structural support, and is definitely part. You definitely get both the heartwood and the sapwood with your lumber. One other part of the log I'll point out are rays, which kind of poke out radially from the center of the tree. You'll see some of that. Rays can affect figuring, and then the growth rings. And and of course the growth rings essentially they come around in concentric circles, and as many of you know, usually the light part of the growth ring is early wood or wood that's rapidly growing in the spring, so it's kind of stretched out and becomes lighter, and then in the summer it slows down and becomes darker, and that's known as late wood, and that also can contribute to figuring in wood, particularly normal figuring. The other part of wood anatomy we'll want to try to bear in mind is when you cut a log, or you look at a log with X-ray vision or whatever, you can get a couple of different views of it, and how a log is cut can have a big impact on what you see as far as figuring. The figuring that we'll be discussing kind of goes along in a longitudinal axis along the length of the log, and this can be tangential, which basically is kind of the flat side of the log, or if you were flat sawing a log, and then the radial, which basically comes straight out from the pith or the center of the tree directly out to the outer edge of the sapwood. So these are a couple of planes that will the same log, depending on how you cut this, will almost always show figuring. One will be different from the other, even though it's basically from the same section of the log. Here's a couple of cuts from boards that what we would call normal figuring, and these are just simply in any of your logs, or any of your boards you might pick up at Home Depot or cut yourself or whatever. If you're kind of flat sawing, just starting at one edge of a log and cutting straight down, you'll often get this U or V-shaped tangential pattern, and these are from growth rings, and you can also maybe see some little ray specks in here. That's real common. You'll see that with your oaks. And then if you come on over here and you're going more with a quarter sawn log or radial sawn log, there you'll see that all of a sudden, instead of these smeared growth rings, the growth rings get real tight, and it's generally considered a stronger wood as well. But again, all these growth rings and rays are also considered a part of normal figuring, and then even knots over here are considered normal figuring. Now, in the lumber and veneer trade, actually, to semi-complicate things, normal figure is actually considered on-figured, and that's kind of the way that we will approach this for the rest of the presentation, but it's kind of good to know that it's all a part of it. So now we want to talk about what is specialty figuring, and we're going to jump straight into figuring that applies primarily to maple. We're just going to talk maple here, not that some of these things couldn't happen. So one is a little bit has a little bit of a twist to it, because actually this figuring is caused by rot or disease. So it's a discoloration of the wood. What ends up happening is that after a maple's been down for a while, it the diseases will actually kind of have a turf war and compartmentalize off their area to I might be anthropomorphizing this a little bit, but to protect kind of protect the area that they're eating through. So this actually this is what it looks like at the end of a log, and so this is what it would look like. It was flat, you know, on the tangential surface or the longitudinally, and then this is the kind of stuff that you would get from that, the spalting. So it's kind of a variation in color. This is real popular with obviously furniture makers, people who like to make knickknacks and those kinds of things. Next up, and really popular, and what probably most people think of when I mention figured maple to them, are burls. These are large, generally kind of ball or ball type shapes that are a result of could be injury, virus, or fungus. It's essentially undirected growth that occurs when all of a sudden the cells begin to divide in odd ways, and so you'll get these spherical protuberances, and then often you'll kind of get these little nipple type shapes, and I think some of those may actually be as a result of not necessarily, or partially as a result of undirected growth that may be coming out of adventitious buds. The material that sits and just lays dormant in the trunks of trees until light or like I said, injury, a virus or a fungus or something like that activates them. So I think these little dimples here could also be as a result of that. Over here we have what this will look like from a in a standing tree, where you can see all these burls here and here and here, and they're just going crazy on this tree. Real popular with bowl makers and just by the craft industry in general. Both the spalting and the burls actually for acoustical instrument component, which is what we're going to zero in on, are generally undesirable. They kind of throw a kink into the most desirable patterns. Now we're going to start to get down to business. Fiddleback and quilted maple figuring are really what we want to really present tonight. This type of figuring is caused by vertical distortions in the grain of a maple. I took this picture just a couple hours ago, threw it in. It just looks like a piece of shredded wood, I know, but it kind of gives you an idea. If you look at this, you can see that instead of the normal horizontal grain that you would get with your average run-of-the-mill chunk of wood, you can kind of see how the grain of the wood goes back and forth, and it's a little. This is more because of the way that I mechanically tore it apart. It still generally follows the axis of the log, but you can really make out how all of a sudden the grains are going back and forth, almost zigzagging, and that's what essentially is the cause of this fiddleback and quilting in maple. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So just some general stand level observations about fiddleback and quilted maple. You may go up to a tree or a log and find out that see that there's figure in it in one area, but that doesn't necessarily mean that figure is going to hold all the way through the trunk of the tree and possibly up into the limbs. Quite often with the fiddleback type of figuring, you'll get a little bit of figuring down near the base of the tree, but it won't carry very far. With the quilt, you may not get it at the base, but you might get it higher up. With both of them, you might get it on one side of a tree, but not on the other. So that'll make a big difference in what value a tree might have. Likewise, particularly with fiddleback, where you have a heavy limb, like you have here on the maple to the left, very common to have just a real short run of figuring right down here. It's usually not very valuable. There are a lot of other issues going on with the grain. So other than maybe for a woodworker, you might get a little bit right there, and it might seem exciting, but there's not going to be a whole bunch to work. The other thing is distribution within a stand. Sometimes you'll get a couple of trees together that will have figuring. Sometimes they'll be scattered. Sometimes it's both. There's really not a given generality one can state about where there's one figured tree, keep looking in that area because there's going to be another. Where that could be true is on a little bit more of a landscape area. Some of you probably have tree farms that are in areas that generally a lot of figured wood seems to show up. If you live in like the Mossy Rock area, East Lewis County, maybe in the Skagit Valley. I live in Sequim, and I know around Port Angeles and then down towards Quilcene. Those are four hot spots that in the several years I've been involved with this, we've seen quite a bit of figuring show up. And then in general, maple figuring that has any real commercial value is very rare. You'll get estimates all over the place, but the guy I consider the expert on this, Steve McMinn, he's the owner of Pacific Rim Tonewoods, my client. Not just because he's my client, but this guy's been doing it for a long time. And he thinks that probably at best only 1 in 500 maple trees actually has consequential figuring. Let's talk a little bit more in depth about quilted figuring. So we were looking earlier about how the grain directions change in quilted and fiddleback. In the case of quilted, the grain directions occur in such of a way that it kind of creates sometimes a popcorn effect, sometimes kind of a long ridgy valley effect, or just depressions or mounds. This normally comes out best when we're doing flat sawn or rotary veneer. So you can see here that there's you can use it for furniture. Pretty popular with furniture. You'll see this more often with the bodies of electrical guitars. And interestingly enough, I was talking with Tom French, who also buys maple down near Quilcene, and he told me that some of this stuff is actually, when they do the rotary cut veneer, they'll send it over to the Middle East, and it'll actually end up on the walls of mosques. It can be popular there, and there are just a number of different uses for quilted figuring. Fiddleback can go by a number of different names. It's all kind of part of the curly figured maple family. Here you can kind of see that it's actually more consistent ridges that occur, even though it kind of looks like a mess out here. And this is where the bark has been peeled off. If you go in here, and again, this is the radial surface coming out from the center of the tree, you pick up these really nice dark lines. Now again, don't get confused. These are not growth rings. The growth rings actually are going to be kind of popping up and down this way. These are kind of will run horizontal on a standing tree. Fiddleback is actually part of the curly figured maple family, I call it. And so it's kind of this ridgy effect. It also has a couple of other names depending on how close together these ridges and valleys are. It can be, it's often called flame. Another word for it is tiger, as in tiger striping. And there certainly are plenty of other local names that it goes by. So when a section of wood with fiddleback is split, like you see right here, it kind of separates along the grains and the rays, and it shows up with this kind of corrugated effect. And during the split, it can not only be seen but felt as well if you run your hand along that. We're really going to talk now. We're really going to keep zooming in on fiddleback because this is where our focus of our research is actually going. So again, the grain direction is at approximate right angles. And the cool thing about this fiddleback is you get a light reflection that even though these are both actually sawn, you can get a good look at in flat. You can kind of see how this figuring goes back and forth. Now, what's going to happen next is we're going to live dangerously, and I am actually going to attempt to leave my PowerPoint presentation and go to the and see if I can figure out how to go and get online real quick. So you can see as the board is being moved up and down, the light becomes dark and the dark becomes light. There's probably some sort of a philosophical message in there, but I'm not sure what it might be. And then to the left is your fiddleback, and to the right is quilt. So you can see there as the orientation changed, the way as the light reflects in and out of those different off those different ridges, they change. How in the world do you find figured wood in the on your tree farm? For standing trees, it's really kind of like looking for a needle in maybe not a full-blown haystack, but at least a small one. Or I might liken it to panning for gold. It's pretty tough to find. The odds are pretty low. There's no sure way to tell from the bark. Some of the more seasoned maple cutters will say that a thicker bark that has kind of a real ridgy and ropey, or an XC kind of like a crossing ridges, are more likely to have figuring. But to really know, you have to cut a window into the tree. You may not need to be this elaborate, but 499 times out of 500, you're going to cut in through the bark and get in deep, usually past through the inner and the outer bark, and expose that sapwood, or at least that little tiny cambium area. And again, most of the time, this is what you're going to get. You're just going to get a smooth surface. But if you get in, if you're fortunate, you'll cut into something and it'll look like this. Now, it usually isn't this prominent, and we'll probably see a few more pictures that'll show some other kind of manifestations of it. But it has a lot of different appearances. But if you come across something that looks like this, you know you may have found something. But again, there's no guarantee that just because you reached up as high as you could get and you found this at say 5 or 6 feet, that at 8 feet you're going to find it. Or if you go around to the other side of the tree, you're going to find it. If you go around to all 4 sides of the tree, there's a good chance that that does have figuring. And as we'll discuss later, you might want to mark that tree and note where it is, and come back to it if it's going to end up on a landing in the near future. A little bit better way to know if it's figuring is if you've got figuring is, and especially the time of year that we're getting into right now when the bark is getting a little bit loose from the tree actively growing in diameter, is when you cut a tree down and pull it out a little bit and a bunch of the bark pops off of it. And with that bark knocked off, you can get a much better look at the tree and a lot more of the surfaces. Now you could do a lot of this with an axe, but and that's what I will do if I'm out in the field and I'm looking at logs that are laying on a landing or out in the field or deeper in the unit is if it hasn't been moved much and there hasn't been much bark knocked off, then I'll use an axe to do that. I mean, you always hate to get breakage in a tree, but one silver lining to that is if a limb pops off or something like that, or you get a gouge somewhere, that will also help you to determine if the figuring isn't just on the surface, but if it goes deeper into the bole of the tree towards the center. Another way to try to determine if a tree may have a figure that goes in deeper is if you can go to the stump of a log that look good and look at either the hinge wood or stump pole. If you look real carefully here, you can see this is just a great. This has got really nice fiddle back going real deep into the tree. The the thing is that if this fiddleback actually only goes in 3 or 4 inches, you really aren't going to get into a high value tree. Usually, you look at maybe wanting to see figure go a hand width or 8, 9, 10 inches deep into a tree, and then you're getting a lot that you can work with. So why is or isn't a maple tree figured? And this is really the question that the research that I'm going to be discussing here in just a minute is really all about. Is it some sort of environmental condition, or does microbes, or a lot of the experienced maple cutters I've talked to, many of them say that they see trees growing on a slope or on a specific aspect. Sun angle, I've heard. It's also, some people will throw out just, moisture, soil types. And I've been around enough now to know that I can't pick out a particular set of environmental conditions. I might say that if a tree is growing on a slope, there may be some tension and compression wood from the way that the gravity is working on that maple that might cause some figuring down near the butt or down on one side of the tree or the other. But there isn't any specific circumstance in that I've been able to figure out. So is it genetic? So if is it passed on from a parent tree to its seedlings or its sprouts? Or is it a combination of both? It could also be, I don't know too much about it, but it could have something to do with the field of epigenetics, where there is something genetic in the tree that gives a tree the potential, but and only some trees have it, and there might be a certain environmental condition that triggers it. So that brings us to the research that I'm involved in with Pacific Rim tonewoods. So the Pacific Rim tonewoods has a mill up between Cedro Woolley and Concrete, but they have a separate research facility in an area called Utopia, which is just a few miles east of Cedro Woolley. And this is kind of their command center. They have a progeny testing site there, but many of the buildings that we're going to be, or much of the equipment that we're going to be looking at here in just a minute are all based there at Utopia Farm. Pacific Rim Tonewoods is betting that figured maple is primarily inherited. There some research that they commissioned from a grad student up in the University of British Columbia. There was evidence of some genetic markers in figured maple. And so their hope is to find 100 figured maples, highly super figured maples, that can be used as parent trees. And from these parent trees, the hope is to develop desirable genetic lines of high quality figured maple. It's quite a project. What I find pretty impressive about this is actually Pacific Rim Tonewoods, they only buy maybe 30 to 50 figured maple logs a year. It probably only makes up about 1% of their business. Most of what they deal with is old growth spruce from British Columbia and Alaska. It's been salvaged, koa from Hawaii, but they've taken a real interest in figured maple. They understand that we're not growing any more of it, and as a matter of fact, due to current silvicultural practices, where we have a tendency to steer our stands towards conifer, Douglas fir, and now cedar and others, or even alder, that there's probably a lot of trees that have been, probably a lot of figured maples that have been cut, and then we've come in later and myself included and sprayed them and killed them without even knowing that we kind of killed the goose that actually was laying golden eggs, and we just never really knew it. So I'm going to go through kind of this will kind of help you count how much longer the presentation is going. I've kind of divided up the process we're using in the 100 Figured Maples project into 10 different steps. So the scope of the project, we're willing to find and eventually and hopefully collect genetic material from figured big leaf maples throughout its natural range. As far north as we've got is kind of the Sumas Mountain area in Whatcom County. And as far south as we've gotten so far, we're for collections is down near Gold Beach, Oregon. We'd be happy to, we have some potentials up in British Columbia. Haven't been invited into Northern California yet, but hopefully something might eventually break down there. But we're trying to get a wide geographical representation. Although, admittedly, the vast majority right now of our parent trees are actually from in the Skagit Valley or within 50 miles of the Skagit Valley. So how do we do this? Well, that's kind of why I'm doing this presentation. We're trying to reach out to forest landowners, whether you're large or small. If you're dealing with, if you have large maples on your property, you could be a potential source for us. if you're somebody that is directly in the business of cutting maples for others, there's a smattering of them up and down throughout the state. Washington and Oregon, love to talk to you and have you share some of your knowledge with us. Loggers, log purchasers, and sawmills that cut maple. We're hoping that all of these folks will perhaps lend a hand to us and alert us if they think they've got something. Here are just some of the statistics or some of the things we're looking for in super figured maple trees. So we're looking for figuring that covers the entire surface of the sapwood up into the branches. So usually we're hoping that it's going to go 20, 30 feet up the tree, maybe even 50, hopefully all the way around. We're asking a lot. Generally, trees that are 24 inches in diameter at breast height are a minimum size, but there are always exceptions. And the smaller the heartwood, the better. You'll recall that I said that it's actually the sapwood that has the best coloring for the figuring. And once you get here into the heartwood, and in this case, of course, we've got some rot, which isn't desirable, even though it looks like this is primarily confined to the heartwood. Under most instances, and particularly for the purposes of the program, if you have too big of a heartwood, then you're not getting that 9 inches plus that you really need to have enough figured wood to work with. Also looking for minimum defect and stain, and we don't really want trees that have a lot of spalting, which is really a type of defect, or that have a lot of burls. They kind of cloud the study, and again, the hope is that we'll pick trees that not only have great figuring, but have a lot of the other attributes that are really good for acoustical instruments. I mentioned earlier about in the field trying to identify whether you have a hot tree or not. And here's an instance where you can see during the yarding or falling process, a chunk of wood got knocked out of the sapwood, and you can kind of see that this figuring actually goes down deep. So that was kind of an exciting indicator of wood. And here you can really see the way the fibers switch are zigzagging back and forth. But I see something like this when I'm looking at a log, and I begin to drool because I'm going, okay, good. This is not just something right on the surface. So when a log has been identified as having super figuring or in the field, or at least has the potential, really where the rubber meets the road is when you can get it to the mill. It doesn't have to be necessarily Pacific Rim Tonewoods mill, but any mill that's cutting maple. And the hope is that whatever mill has that log, has purchased that log, will open it up and then evaluate and let us know what's going on, whether that figuring held, whether there were problems and so forth and so on, or whether it's just plain a great log. So again, this is really the moment of truth as to whether a candidate log is good for the program. So let's say we've opened up a log. Maybe in here, at least for those of you with a wide screen, you can even see here, doesn't take much imagination to see figuring on this cut. But once you open up a log and it looks good and we've decided to go for it, then some real work starts. So this has to do, we need to go ahead and actually find where the stump is that log came off of. This is a site just north of Polsbo where I called out to look. There was some good figuring, and I did see a lot of stumps that looked like this, and they looked like they had great potential, but we have no idea how far that goes up. So even though you may have a stump on your property that's figured, if we don't know what happened above the stump, we can't really use it to the program. But we're talking about logs that did work out, and so what may happen is we may take measurements to try to determine what the diameter of those logs were, what the diameters were, and also maybe take butt-in pictures of the log, assign it, give it some sort of a designated number, and then walk out where we think that maple tree came from and compare our measurements and our picture of the butt end of the log. And the best way to do this is you actually take the picture and then you kind of have to inverse it so that it will actually do the best job of helping you match to the stump. And then hopefully you'll go on out, and in this case, this is a place up on Clear Lake Hill out of Cedar Woolley. You'll be able to find the stump that log came off of. And it's obviously easiest if we're able to get on out there and get into the process early. Now, we have also been on a search, and I've actually spent a lot of time and had some success looking for the parent stumps of old historic figured maple logs. And these are kind of the legends. And I primarily get these from a couple of experienced maple cutters. You probably can't recognize her, but some of you that are from Southwest Washington may have worked with Lana Massa, who's primarily doing architectural maple right now. But she's taken me to several stumps where she's had great documentation, and her experience was that the log got cut up, looked at, and even though it was 7-8 years ago, she was still able to go on out and find this and at least one other stump for me. Unfortunately, sometimes, particularly where these are in the deep forest, on a clear cut, it seems like you can't stop the maples from sprouting if you want to. But surprisingly enough, where there's a lot of shade, well, it shouldn't be surprising, even though big leaf maple is known for some shade tolerance, its sprouting isn't necessarily vigorous. This particular site was outside of Longview, where we were looking at this one. We've made some successful cuttings from this one. So what happens is that once I've been able to secure permission from the landowner, we've ascertained it's a great maple, it's a super figured maple, and it's got sprouts. And I've gotten permission. I run on out there, usually in the late spring, and try to collect a bunch of the sprouts. And we're primarily looking for the sprouting that has occurred for this year. So in this case, you can kind of see where this cutting right here, it generally has the color kind of changes, but it might have a specific color, and you'll see the color change from last year's to this year's. And so we'll go ahead and cut this whole thing, and then we're actually able to, from that chunk of the sprout, as you'll see here in a second, we'll make a cut when it gets to Utopia. They'll cut it here and here and here, and we'll be able to use these segments to hopefully, and right here too, to hopefully get a good cutting. So we might get 4 or 5 sprouts, 4 or 5 cuttings from each sprout. So it's kind of a real time crunch. Once we get these cuttings, I try to get them wet down real good, stuffed into these sacks. I bring them up, put them in coolers, sometimes with a little bit of ice on the bottom. We don't want them to heat up. And get them into Utopia. And here you can see where the cuttings are placed in a medium here to promote root growth after they're cleaned up. And hopefully, once these are in, we'll set them into a greenhouse, which I'll show you for a second. And there may also be instances where we may have just really limited cuttings, and in this case, we could send them to a lab south of Olympia where the cells from the buds of the trees are the apical meristems, I believe, are taken, some of the cells, and then they are essentially cloned in that laboratory. These can be hard to do from a cutting straight out of the woods because these are kind of what we call dirty. There's already a lot of diseases and stuff that have landed on the buds, and these work better when they're kind of come more from a controlled environment. So the cuttings are all placed in these small containers to start with, in a carefully controlled environment. Where it gets misted at certain times, the humidity is controlled. They're watched for diseases. You can even see here, does this maple leaf look a little strange to some of you? Some of the they found that if, and this is kind of counterintuitive to what what normal nursery practices have done, but they found that if these cuttings transpire or photosynthesize too much, out of the leaf, it can be actually detrimental to the survival. So they actually reduce the leaf area to help survivability. And then once these have kind of shown some good vigor, look like they're going to survive, then these same cuttings will come out outside. And this whole area is fenced off so critters can't get in, and are grown even larger. Now, it probably goes without saying, but each cutting is carefully tracked, and we know exactly which, and they're all kind of bundled into families, and we know which stump and which log, and all the documentation that we have on that log follows each of these cuttings. And then finally, these same trees are outplanted, these same containers are outplanted into progeny testing sites. So here's one that's a few years old. You can see that even though the area is fenced all the way around it to keep the big game out, it's also treated with an herbicide to help reduce competition, and also with this sure many of you have seen these in riparian planting areas, but this barrier right here, that's primarily meant to limit access to the small stem from meadow mice or voles, I should say. These are a little bit older here. This is just kind of a small one, but these are probably, I don't know, 5 to 7 years old now at this point. But again, kind of still the number of families are still limited that we have. As a matter of fact, we're trying to get 100, and we're probably in various stages. We've only collected 30 to 40, and some of those we're actually still trying to working with having successful cloning. So there are actually 2 progeny testing sites. This one at Utopia. There's another one up towards Birdsview, and Pacific Rim Tonewoods is also, and I'm not sure how far along they are, but I think I actually may have seen somebody, the name of somebody that that I believe we're trying to work an acquisition with, kind of out out towards Clear Lake for a third site. And so each of these sites will have about 30 trees placed on a carefully designed grid, as you're seeing here. And again, the different families are all identified, and we're also looking at having 3 different spacings, so that not only can we see how the trees grow over the next 20 or 30 years in terms of how figuring develops, but also using these spacings to see what kind of effect that has on form and growth. All right. So if you think you can help us, I would sure appreciate it if you'd contact us. So in summary, if you like this project and want to help, if you've sold or purchased a high value figured maple log and you think there's a chance we can find where that stump was, give me a call. If you're getting ready to harvest and you have an area with larger maples and you suspect figuring could be present. So again, larger maples means 2 feet in diameter at breast height. Give me a call, and so whether we end up coming on out and trying to buy maple logs from you or somebody else does, if I'm aware of it and I can mark the trees, and if I have time, sometimes I'll be able to at least do a sample look and see if I can find figuring in there, kind of give you an idea as to whether or not you might have something. This can also be a lead, although this is until the trees actually get cut and are on the ground and are pulled to the landing, you're usually not going to have a really good idea of whether you might have a lot of good figuring in a stand. So again, this needs to be an area that's going to be harvested. We really don't want to come on out and check for figuring in areas that are not going to be harvested. To go ahead and put chips in to cut windows in a bunch of maples is going to have the potential to introduce disease. Probably not enough to kill it, but it still probably isn't a great idea. And so again, we're looking for areas that have the potential of harvest in the next year or two. And then finally, if you know somebody that might have knowledge of a super figured maple tree or log, I'd appreciate you turning me on to who that might be, so that I can contact them. I've learned that this job is about 10% forester and 90% detective. And we know that we have a lot of false leads and dead ends, but every once in a while we hit pay dirt. And the more people we talk to and are aware of our project, the better. As a matter of fact, in the program, this is a list, and it probably isn't updated, but this is a list of some of the folks that have helped us locate super figured maples. I see a number of folks on here actually that are members of the Washington Farm Forestry Association, all over in here. And so anyway, if you think you can, if you can help us, that'd be great. And I think at this point, I'm ready to take questions. Elaine, if you've been able to put some together.
Great. Well, thanks very much, John. That was super interesting. And obviously, Pacific Tonewoods has a long vision here that they're trying to implement, because that's not a small matter to undertake that. And apparently must be pretty well funded. There was just a couple of questions that came up, but I think you've probably answered them. There was a question about, is quilted the same as figured maple? And I think you said yes, it's just a
Mhm.
variety. Um, and then there was a question about, can you plant it and do something, manipulate it to create the figure? And I think what you've said is basically no.
That's
At
correct.
least we
Yeah,
don't know that we can do that.
correct.
Um, so those were the two that came in the chat. And I think people can put the questions in the chat or they can unmute. And while they're doing that, I had a couple of questions. I have quite a bit of bigger maple on my place, but it's not this sort of straight single stem stuff. It has multiple stems, and they might, and they're falling over actually.
Okay.
So I guess the question is, if this thing is already on the ground, how long is it useful to, have a look at it? Because
Yeah.
it'll probably be a year before it gets logged. So I don't know if it have any value uh,
Yeah, yeah. So
on the ground for a
it,
while.
yeah, so it could have some even if a maple's been on the ground for a year or two, it or even longer, it may have some value in terms of figuring, uh, in terms of maybe some spalting, uh, or for architecture, and woodworkers may still be able to use it. Unfortunately, when we're talking about using the quilted and the fiddleback, and particularly the fiddleback is what we're focusing on. Usually, if we can't get to it within a month or 6 weeks, depending on who is, depending on what season it is, it may be, we kind of need to get it fresh, I guess, fresher than that.
So it has to
So
be
I'd say
sawn
four
when
to
it's
six
fresh?
weeks.
It has to be sawn when it's fresh, or just looked at?
Probably sawn would be ideal. Yeah, you don't want to leave them too long. I would shoot for trying not to go more than 4 to 6 weeks. That's what Pacific Rim Tonewoods prefers.
Okay. So we have a great question here from Jim. He says, who's buying figured maple in Whatcom County? And how can you as a forest owner know with any certainty what a log's value is if it has to get to the mill before the value is determined?
Pacific Rim Tonewoods buys logs up in Whatcom County. I believe there are several there. I believe there is somebody else around Sumas. But I'm not being coy here, but I honestly don't have their name at hand. There is somebody else up in the Whatcom area, but if if you wanted to give either Brian Sweeney or Kevin Burke a call, and you're up in Whatcom County, they kind of cover that northwest Skagit, Whatcom, Snohomish area, and I have a tendency to take on the areas that are further on. And was there another part to that question? I'm sorry.
So as the forest owner, how can you know with any certainty what the log value is if it has to get to the mill before you can even figure out if there's any value there? In other words, I guess it's the opportunity of understanding what you have rather than the person, carting away your log and then saying there was no value in it or there was a lot of value in it. It's just that,
Yeah,
when the Doug fir gets on the truck, you pretty much know, okay, what you're going to get. But it sounds like with the maple, you really don't know because the person doesn't know until they cut it open.
yeah. So there's a couple of different ways that this can be structured. So I'll start with what Pacific Rim Tonewoods does. There's a couple of different reasons why they do this, but uh, uh, if you get a log buyer from Pacific Rim Tonewoods out there, what they're going to do is they'll look at the log on the landing, they'll look at some chips, they'll look at the stump pole, they'll look at all those deals, and what they will do is say, okay, this could have some good figuring in it. We don't know. But I'll tell you what, here's what we'll do. We'll pay you $1 a board foot or $3 a board foot or something like that. And then they'll do they'll scale it and they'll just offer that to you. And then that will be the price you get. And then Pacific Rim Tonewoods will take that log back to their mill and they will open it up and they may go, wow, this is great. We did really well on this log. Or they may open it up and they'll go, this thing is a dud, uh, uh, and throw it on, and it may only be good for firewood. So the amount you're usually getting from somebody who's buying on a log is they're certainly hedging it a little bit because there's some uncertainty and some risk. The other way you can do this, and this has been real common, is that you'll find a maple cutter that's running around and you'll work out some sort of a deal with them where they'll come on out and cut the log up into blocks, which will later be turned into billets and kind of gone down. And they'll take these blocks to a mill, and then they will tell the landowner, well, we'll do 50-50, whatever we get from the mill, we'll give you. So this is kind of similar to a kind of a scale sale, whereas Pacific Rim Tonewoods kind of gives you a lump sum sale. Those blocks are all hauled to the mill. You're hoping that none of them are getting diverted. You're hoping that whatever mill they're going to, and they won't go to Pacific Rim Tonewoods. PRT won't buy blocks. It's just there's a lot of potential for some of you may have heard, but actually figured maple. There's been some big problems with people taking figured maple that didn't belong to them, and so Pacific Rim Tonewoods doesn't buy out of the back of a pickup truck for that reason, because we can't really establish a chain of custody. That doesn't mean to say that folks who do cut it up on site aren't legit, and I know that I've ran into several that I would have a high degree of confidence in, but that's kind of the other way of doing it. Does that make sense? Do you need a follow-up question for clarification?
And I think you answered this. One of our members is having maple milled on site. Is there a specific way to have it milled so if its high figuring is discovered, is cut in a way so it could still be sold to Pacific Rim because it's being milled on their site as opposed to carted in?
Yeah. So we would not buy. We would not buy blocks like that, but there may be folks that would. So generally, I was talking to a fella down who's been very helpful, Rod Jacobs, and most of the time what'll happen is that he'll cut his blocks up to where they're 8 to 8 to 10 inches wide, 22 inches long, and a couple of inches deep. And but everybody, you're going to get different specs from different mills. Whoever asked that question, maybe if they wanted to contact me, I'd be happy to. It doesn't sound like Pacific Rim Tonewoods could help them, but I do have a somewhat extensive network, and I might be able to, without recommending anybody and all the other disclaimers, I might be able to steer them in a direction. One of the things I have to say that I have found is that there are people that are really helpful with this project, mills and maple cutters, and then there are a lot that see this project as a competition or a way for Pacific Rim Tonewoods to maybe wiggle our way into their working circle, and I can understand that thinking to an extent. But because of that, unfortunately, I have contact and relationships with some, but not all, maple buyers in the state and in Oregon to an extent too.
Wow. Well, so any last questions for the good of the order? We've kept John here for an hour and a half working hard. So if there's any more questions, we'll just take them. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for coming.